Hi, my name is Cassandra Strittmater. Today is September 3rd, 2020, and I will be discussing hormonal control of implantation and early embryonic development. So I'll start with a basic overview of the female reproductive system. The uterus seen in the middle of the diagram is the site for implantation, specifically the endometrium. The endometrium is an inner layer of epithelium with glands that will dip into the outer two layers. Connected to the uterus are the fallopian tubes where fertilization will take place. The fallopian tubes consist of longitudinal and circular smooth muscle that is ciliated to act as a tube for transport of an oocyte to the uterus. At the opposing end of the fallopian tubes, you will see fimbriae, which are finger-like projections that have flared open ends, which end very close to the ovaries to collect the released oocyte. The ovary is where the process all starts under hormonal control. So this is what the inside of an ovary could look like at any given time. There are multiple follicles that can be seen at different stages. At birth up until puberty, there are only primordial follicles, which are seen at the top right of this picture, and those consist of a single layer of granulosa cell precursors and is enclosed in a basal lamina. Once puberty sets in, some follicles will become a primary follicle, moving left in the diagram seen. Development will continue into a secondary follicle, which will start producing hormones and enzymes needed for the following steps I will be talking about. Under normal circumstances, only one tertiary follicle will become a dominant follicle, which will release an oocyte, which is known as ovulation. Okay. In the early follicular phase of the tertiary follicle becoming a dominant follicle, the hormones are produced. GnRH, or gonadotrophin-releasing hormone, from the hypothalamus stimulates gonadotropin secretion from the anterior pituitary, which will cause a release of FSH, which is follicle-stimulating hormone, and LH, which is luteinizing hormone. FSH works on the granulosa cells to secrete AMH, which is anti-Müllerian hormone, which will prevent multiple follicles from developing into dominant follicles. LH acts on the thecal cells to produce androgens, which will diffuse across the basal lamina and the granulosa cells into the antral space. There, aromatase will convert androgens into estrogens. Estrogen will act as a negative feedback loop for FSH, LH, and GnRH to prevent additional follicle maturation, which will act on granulosa cells to continue making more estrogen. In the later follicular phase, there is only one dominant follicle developing, and estrogen levels are peaking. FSH is no longer being released due to the granulosa cells secreting inhibin. The high estrogen levels are creating a GnRH surge, though, so therefore LH will also be surging. This stimulation of thecal cells is needed for oocyte maturation. Progesterone is also being released during this surge. That will cause meiosis to resume in the oocyte to divide it into a primary and secondary oocyte along with a polar body. At the same time, antral fluid is building up and the follicle is at its greatest size in preparation for the release of an egg. Okay, so LH levels peak, which you can see in the middle of the diagram above the ovulation stage. So after the LH peaks, 16 to 24 hours later, ovulation occurs. The mature follicle secretes prostaglandins and proteolytic enzymes such as MMP, which is matrix metalloproteinase, which will dissolve the collagen and other components of the connective tissue holding the follicular cell together. So now the antral fluid and egg can spurt out of the ovary into the fallopian tubes. That egg that just spurted out now has 2 to 3 layers of granulosa cells, while it only had one as a primordial follicle. So the space left behind from the follicle rupturing is filled by follicular thecal cells. That follicle now becomes a luteal cell, known as a corpus luteum, which will produce hormones. This process is called luteinization, which is when the luteal cells accumulate lipid droplets and glycogen granules in their cytoplasm and begin to secrete hormones. The corpus luteum will secrete hormones to maintain implantation, such as progesterone and estrogen. These changes also stimulate the endometrium to prepare for pregnancy. The uterus endometrium will become a secretory structure by the glands coiling and adding additional blood vessels into the connective tissue layer of the uterus. Lipids and glycogen will also deposit in the cytoplasm, which will provide nourishment while the placenta is developing. So while the luteal phase discussed prior is being conducted, the oocyte has entered the fallopian tube. In order for fertilization to occur, sperm from a male must be present. After intercourse and the sperm is deposited, the final maturation step of sperm will occur, which is known as capacitation. These steps are needed for the sperm to penetrate the oocyte's protective granulosa cells and the zona pellucida, which consist of a protective glycoprotein layer. Sperm will use enzymes for the acrosomal reaction to dissolve oocyte cell junctions and the zona pellucida. Once the cortical reaction of the sperm and egg joining is complete, the egg granules in the peripheral cytoplasm will release contents to avoid any other sperm joining the oocyte. At this time, a second meiosis division will occur. So it takes 4 to 5 days for the fertilized egg to make it through the fallopian tubes into the uterus for implantation. When entering the uterus, the egg is now called a blastocyst, which will implant into the endometrium. Cells that form the placenta will form finger-like chorionic villi first. The corpus luteum will secrete hormones needed to maintain early stages of pregnancy until the placenta is finished developing. Okay, so the hormones that maintain the early stages of pregnancy involve 4 primary ones. The corpus luteum will secrete majority of these until 7 weeks post-fertilization, at which point the placenta will take over hormone secretion and the corpus luteum will become an inactive corpus albicans. So the peptide hormone HCG, which stands for human chorionic gonadotropin, is secreted from the developing placenta and binds to LH receptors to keep the corpus luteum actively producing progesterone until the placenta takes over, and then the levels of HCG will drop. HCS, which stands for human chorionic somatotropin, is produced by the developing placenta and is needed to alter the mother's glucose and fatty acid metabolism to support fetal growth. Estrogen and progesterone are produced by the corpus luteum and the placenta. Progesterone is needed to maintain endometrium lining to carry the pregnancy to full gestation period. The developing embryo will float in the amniotic fluid where it will obtain oxygen and nutrients through the placenta and umbilical cord until birth. Thank you for listening to my presentation.